Welcome to Spirit's Journey, coming to you live on Truth Frequency Radio and simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio. Your hosts are Patrick and Catherine Andrews.
Join us each week as we explore a wide range of metaphysical topics such as dreams, astrology, intuitive readings, and life purpose. You'll receive practical guidance so that you can live your most awesome life.
Learn more about what we do at intuitiveschool.com and connect with us on Facebook at Spirit's Journey Radio. Welcome to Spirit's Journey. We are coming to you live on Truth Frequency Radio, also being simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio, among others. For example, you can find us on iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and TalkStream Live. We're here in the Heartland, holding the energy for spiritual truth and awareness. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Catherine. Welcome, everyone, for another awesome Saturday show. We have got Reverend Jim Gaither today, and I'm going to tell you a little about him because it's quite interesting. We're going to get into a lot of the unity philosophy. He was ordained as a unity minister in 1979, and he has his master's in philosophy and his doctorate in theology. He currently does teach distance learning for Holos University, Unity Worldwide Spiritual Institute, the Unity Urban Ministerial School, and Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. He's published two books that we're going to talk about today, The Essential Charles Fillmore and The Hidden Realm of God, The Historical Jesus and His Healing Philosophy. So welcome, Jim.
Hey, Jim.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be here. It's good talking to you again.
So I'm so excited to get into how we can, help people today with the different unity teachings, with all the chaos going on in the world. So I wanted to start off with your book, The Hidden Realm of God. And in that, it's very interesting because you get in depth about Jesus' healing philosophy. And so I wonder, first of all, what was his healing philosophy, and how can that help us today?
Well, that's a good general question to start. And actually, when I say a healing philosophy, I want to be clear that when I'm not saying that Jesus had a philosophy about healing, but rather that his ideas, as I characterize it, his philosophy can have a healing impact and had a healing impact historically on the people around him. So the ideas, really sort of, in a way, this started when I recognized that a number of studies, scientific studies, had been done on things like how prayer, the effects of prayer and meditation, psychological effects of forgiveness, which obviously is part of Jesus' teaching. Some really interesting studies on how contemplation of love impacts our immune system. So when I noticed that these studies were being done and there were some, positive indications from them, I thought, well, it would be interesting to identify the basic themes in the teachings of Jesus, but also his style of teaching, and connect those ideas with what we know from, I guess, what you would call holistic health research, which is, how do our attitudes, our thoughts, even our spiritual practices, how do those things affect our health? And so that's sort of the foundation, I guess, for the whole original study, which the book is actually based on the dissertation I did at Holos University Graduate Seminary, so I didn't. The book is not the dissertation; is based on it. So the dissertation is a lot more complicated than the book is. It covers a lot more ground. But so that's how it all started, and because Jesus had, according to the Gospels and other sources, Jesus had a healing impact on people. And so part of what I was trying to do is to identify, are there things that we can understand from what he said and how he said it to how that might have had an effect on people. And I'm not claiming that it's only the teachings or what he said or his words that had the healing impact, because I also believe in, as a metaphysician, I believe in one mind, and I believe in consciousness. So I think that there's an element of consciousness that we can't really, with Jesus and with and probably with other we would call spiritual healers or spiritual healers that we can't really get at just by looking at the words. But the words, I think, indicate the consciousness. So there's inferences we can make in that direction as well. So that's, I don't know, I guess that I hope that answers your question, at least as a start to the answer.
So I'm curious about the language that Jesus uses, because we have a friend, Michael Rice. He talks a lot about how a lot of Jesus' original teachings were lost in the translation, because a lot of the Gospels that we go back to are in Greek, because that was a language that was frequently used in like academic texts of the time and things like that. Whereas Jesus was said to speak Aramaic at the time, which, from what I've learned of it, Aramaic seems to have a much more kind of a basic metaphysical kind of a perspective to that. And one of the most common misunderstandings that I remember having pointed out to me early on that I thought was remarkable was that the word sin actually comes from a Greek word that was more related to archery. It's more like when Jesus said, "Go and sin no more," the word that he probably used was something closer to, go and, stay on the mark. It's like you missed the mark, you're off target, go and keep your mind focused on, the target. Was kind of more the image that I have of what he was talking about. So I'm curious, when you were talking about that, it's actually what Jesus was saying that was very healing in his philosophy, rather than, these very specific healing experiences that are often referred to again and again in the Bible. Did you find that anything related to that in terms of, how that translates into modern language and maybe some of the misunderstandings that we have along the way?
Oh yeah, there's always difficulties with translation and getting at, something's always lost in translation, as they say. For one thing, as the sayings, the original sayings might very well have had things like rhythm and alliteration and a suggestiveness of the original words that doesn't translate. So that's always a challenge for translators. Regarding Jesus speaking in Aramaic, I think there's some evidence, although it's inferential, that Jesus was bilingual. For example, one of the things that I've noticed is that there are, according to biblical scholarship and just analysis of the Gospels, that the author of Matthew and the author of Luke had lists of sayings that they both used, but they used them in somewhat different, sometimes they used them in somewhat different contexts or different order. This was referred to by the scholars as the Q Gospel, which is believed to be a lost sayings gospel, very similar to actually the Gospel of Thomas that has been recovered. But one of the things that I noticed was there are a couple of sayings where that Luke and Matthew are both clearly drawing from that same sayings list, but there'd be like one word that was different. So I'm trying to think of an example. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. We find that saying in Matthew. Whereas in Luke it says, be compassionate as your Father in heaven is compassionate. Well, these sayings are found in a similar context, and they're word for word basically identical, except for that one word, perfect, those two words, I should say, perfect and compassionate. If you look back at if you look back to what an Aramaic origin of those words would be, the word could mean either one of those things. It could mean either perfect or compassionate. The same word has those two different meanings. And so it looks like what Matthew and Luke have done there is they've simply chosen a different Greek word to translate the word used by Jesus. Now, the kind of interesting thing about that is all the other translations are identical, meaning so what I'm getting from that, and there's a couple other passages where you find the same thing. They're rare, but you find them. What I'm getting at is that Jesus may well, we're told Jesus spoke to Gentiles. He spoke to Romans and others who would not have understood Aramaic, but they would have understood Greek. So Jesus, among his Aramaic-speaking disciples, may very well have spoken only in Aramaic, but to outsiders or those who knew Greek better, he might have spoken in Greek, but occasionally interjected a Hebrew word or an Aramaic word that they were familiar with. Such as the word shalom. There's another case where you find Luke and Matthew, the basic difference seems to revolve around a word similar to or related to the word shalom, which can mean peace, but is also used as a greeting, right? So one of them translates it as peace, the other translates it as the idea of a greeting someone. So, for example, even today, people will say, shalom, which means, sort of in a literal way, sort of means peace, but it also is simply a way of greeting. It's a way of saying hello and goodbye, much like in Hawaiian aloha, right? Mm-hmm. So it has those double uses. So my suspicion is simply because the Gospels and all other evidence indicates that he taught to both the people who are local, who would have spoken Aramaic, but also to Gentiles, as they're called. And the Gentiles wouldn't have understood Aramaic. So I suspect he was bilingual. And so that creates even more difficulties for translation. So in my book, I mentioned some things like that. I have to kind of focus on the content of the sayings, but I can also identify certain elements of style that would translate regardless of what language is used. For example, Jesus used paradoxical kinds of sayings and stories with ambiguity, which was a matter of style rather than specifically of language. So I'm sure there's some subtleties in Aramaic that don't translate well into Greek. So, and we don't really have any good way of sorting out, what did he say in Greek, what did he say in Aramaic, or whether he spoke exclusively in Aramaic. That's another sort of whole difficult historical question. So there's a lot of things that we don't know at this point, and we may never find out unless new information literally is dug up from the earth, new documents or archaeological discoveries.
Interesting. So, how then did his philosophy? You were talking about that it's more like that his philosophy was healing, and yet there's a lot of these healing episodes that are recounted in the Gospels. So do you still think that like those healing miracles that people refer to a lot of times actually happened, or were those more kind of used as a teaching tool?
That's a really good question. Again, that's sort of a historical question. I believe that the evidence is very strong that Jesus was a healer of the type that was found in those days. So he wouldn't have been a medical practitioner or something like as we think in modern terms. Maybe something more like a shaman, as we might think of today, or maybe a psychologist, or as I said, a spiritual or consciousness healer. And I'd have to say that, for example, the kind of what we're looking at here is how did what he said affect the people around him in their historical context. One relatively simple way to get at this is looking at the emphasis that he placed on forgiveness, in his teachings, in his stories, and in sort of straightforward statements such as "forgive and you will be forgiven," and the stories that he told people that they were forgiven, that they were released from whatever was burdening them. All right, so think about the psychological impact of on someone who feels burdened by guilt, and probably also, or in some cases, shame and the stress that puts on someone, and how coming to or being told by someone that they see as an authority, or someone who is convincing about it, who tells them that that they are forgiven, that they can release all of that sort of stuff, and how that could release the stress. And one of the things that we know about scientifically about physical health and illness is that stress is a contributing factor to a lot of illnesses, and in some cases it might be the main factor. So finding ways to release that stress, for whatever reason however it was caused, can result in a recovery that may be gradual, but may also be very sudden. I've had experiences myself in meditation where I had sort of, in effect, instantaneous healings by getting my consciousness off the problem and my consciousness into the realm of the spiritual truth, or contemplating the nature of God, where I'm not thinking about the problem, but I'm thinking about what in metaphysics is sometimes called truth, or with theology, thinking about God, the contemplation of God. I've had sort of immediate healings rather than gradual ones. So I believe it's not only possible, but entirely probable that the stories reflect an historical truth. Also, there are some stories of healing that don't fit the pattern of these sort of archetypal healing stories that you find in ancient culture. Okay, so like, for example, an example of archetypal healing would be someone healing the blind, or cleansing a leper. All right, so those things probably happen, but there's also sort of more miraculous kinds of stories that we can't be certain about. But there's also other stories that there would be no reason to tell them because they don't connect to, for example, stories of healings in the Hebrew Scriptures. They don't culturally connect to those. So, like the very first healing story that probably the first one recorded was in the Gospel of Mark. In Mark, when Jesus encounters Peter and Andrew for the first time, and Jesus goes to Peter's house. Peter invites him to his house for a meal, and when he gets there, Peter's mother-in-law is ill with a fever. Okay, well, there's very few cases. There aren't any precedents for someone healing. A story of healing of a fever, which might not have been thought of necessarily as miraculous per se, since very often healings of fever are sort of immediate. They're sort of, the fever breaks, as they say in medical terms today. So that story doesn't really fit the notion of the miracle worker that the ancient world has. So why is that story included in there? And the hypothesis of a number of scholars is that, well, the story is included in there because it's based on a well-known fact, and that would have been known to the people in the community, that the people in the community that Jesus walked among, and also the Christian community in general. So that's kind of an example of how scholars sort of sort through stories that are told in the Gospels and try to figure out, well, what's the probable explanation for this story? Is it told to make a teaching point? Is it told to show that Jesus was the Son of God and a miracle worker, or was it told just because it was generally known? And that seems to be one of the things about Jesus that was generally known, was that he was a healer. So I personally think there's the weight of historical evidence is on the side of Jesus being healer, even if we don't know if every story is reflective of an actual historical event, or whether it's based on something that actually happened. That's a more challenging question, I guess, from a historian's point of view. From a point of view of faith, or from the point of view of what we call spiritual interpretation of the Scriptures, in a way, the question is a matter of really, do you believe that these things are possible? Do you believe that Jesus did these things on the side of faith, and on the sort of spiritual interpretation side, we might look at this story and say, what can this tell us about our own consciousness? What can this tell us about our own development? What's the sort of inner meaning of the story?
That's fascinating, Jim. Yeah, and I love the talk about, healing and Jesus, because I think that's so needed today with what's going on. So I thought it'd be kind of neat to segue, talking about the Unity movement that was basically founded on healing, a lot of it, because Myrtle Fillmore fell ill with tuberculosis, for our listeners that aren't familiar with the story. And she said, I'm going to heal myself of tuberculosis. And prayer, and eventually healed herself of tuberculosis. And so I thought it'd be fascinating if we look at the situation today, compare it with what's going on and what Myrtle Fillmore would say today. So just to compare, so tuberculosis, there's currently 1.5 million deaths a year, approximately, from tuberculosis. That's from the Worldometer's website. And tuberculosis is actually one of the 10 causes of death in the world. It is very contagious. It's spread by droplets through the air. And somebody could be contagious with tuberculosis for up to 2 weeks, even after they start their medication. They're still contagious for 2 weeks. So very contagious, just like they're claiming COVID is. And so in Myrtle Fillmore's day, she didn't take any of that to stop her, and she didn't, freak out about it. She said, I'm going to heal myself. She took the power of the mind. Now, today, we're not really seeing people doing that. People are hiding in their basements, masking themselves, saying, I'm going to hide from Mother Nature, and we're going to shut down the entire world economy, cause endless problems with recessions, kids out of school, unemployment, on and on the list goes. So I'm curious, Jim, what do you think Myrtle Fillmore would say today about the world's response to this virus, which, by the way, tuberculosis today has a 3% death rate. COVID has a 0.2%, 0.26% death rate. So tuberculosis is way more serious. It's been around way longer. So what do you think Myrtle Fillmore would say about how people are reacting to this response? And, churches, closed down churches. Nobody's even going to church.
That's a really interesting question, and I always hesitate to try to figure out what someone in the past would say about a current situation. I can't really speak for them. What I can tell you sort of what my take is on it as a longtime Unity minister and Unity student, but I couldn't really tell you that's exactly what Myrtle would say. I think that, well, for one thing, if you don't mind, I'd like to do a little bit of a digression, because the story about Myrtle's healing is directly related to some of the things I was talking about in the philosophy of the historical philosophy of Jesus. And there's just really just a quick point, the healing philosophy of Jesus. Myrtle's healing began, as you know, when she heard a New Thought lecture, and the lecturer talked about how, as children of God, we do not inherit sickness. And Myrtle had this realization in that moment when she heard that she expressed later as, I'm a child of God and I do not inherit, therefore I do not inherit sickness. Now the key element, the sort of connection with the teachings of Jesus, is that is another element of his healing philosophy. He went around telling people that God is our Father. That got sort of later twisted in by theology into, well, Jesus was the one and only Son of God. But his teaching makes clear that that's how he looked at people, and that's what he taught them, that they were children of God, right? And so what that would have done psychologically and spiritually is shifted people out of the thought pattern that of God as a judge who was always looking at their mistakes and prepared to punish them either in the present life or in a future life. So there's a lot of fear and anxiety related to people's understanding of their relationship to God. Jesus' teaching shifted that to the idea of a God who was loving, who would take care of all of their needs, who would not send any punishment on them, but rather would forgive them. That shifted their whole sort of perspective. And, I think if we try to understand this, what's happening here physiologically, the release of stress and the shift helps or assists the body's immune system, and sort of that would happen to be the sort of what it would look like physically as the immune system kicks in, right, and works more powerfully and strongly to eliminate the problem. And as you noted, Myrtle's healing occurred over time. So the shift happened first from that realization, and then from her focus of her thought into what she called prayer, what we might also call meditation, which is another way of among a number. It actually does a number of things positively physiologically that I go into in the book, but I won't get into here. But part of that is the immune system. So that's kind of a way of looking at what happened with Myrtle and how that's related to the teachings of Jesus. As far as pandemics go, one of the teachings, and this is actually more, Myrtle makes reference to this, but also Charles Fillmore probably talks more extensively about it. There's this idea of what he called, what he referred to as race consciousness, which meant something different then than it does now. What it meant was collective consciousness, how collective consciousness affects.
Jim, that's our cue that we're going to be going into the break. So if you can hold that thought for just a moment, we'll pick up right where we left off. We're going to be going into a 3-minute break, so please take just a moment to listen to our sponsors and join us on the other side.
We are TFR.
My faith in destiny is all I need to prevail.
Truth Frequency Radio.
And we are back. If you're just joining us, this is Spirit's Journey with Patrick and Catherine Andrews, coming to you live on Truth Frequency Radio and Oneness Talk Radio. We are here today with Reverend Jim Gaither. So, Jim, we were just leaving off with the healing ministry of Myrtle Fillmore and her healing journey with healing herself of tuberculosis and how that might apply to what we're experiencing today with the coronavirus.
Right. Well, we were just getting into... I was just about to make a point about one of the Unity's teachings about collective consciousness, and there's actually a couple of things I think that are related to this. One is the concept of collective consciousness, what is in medical terms called a placebo effect, and of course the fundamental metaphysical idea that reality is ultimately a matter of mind rather than matter. Okay, so I'll try to sort this out a little bit. One of the things I wanted to say about collective consciousness is the Fillmores recognized that humanity collectively holds to certain beliefs and certain ideas, and some of those ideas are positive, but some of them are also destructive. So to some degree, the metaphysical or spiritual treatment is to try to eliminate from at least from the individual's consciousness, the impact of the collective consciousness. So here's how that relates to something like a pandemic. In reacting to or in responding to the collective consciousness, you cannot immediately change everyone's belief. You cannot immediately change the collective consciousness. You might be able to. You can help people as individuals and sometimes small groups of people change their consciousness and come into a higher realization, as Myrtle did in her healing, as Charles did in his, and others in that tradition have done. So when people, Unity people wonder, well, how should we respond to these recommendations to quarantine, and these recommendations to wear a mask? Realize that part of what's going on here is if you are not, let's use an concrete example, if you're not wearing a mask in among a group of people who believe that the mask is protective, you can create not a healing effect, but an anxiety effect because of what their beliefs currently are. And so a simple reason to wear a mask and social distance and those sorts of things that are being recommended, if you're a metaphysician and you believe it's ultimately all mind and everything can be healed by mind, a reasonable response is to not create more anxiety than there already is. That's to me. That's just a sort of a matter of responding to others in love, to help those that you can, and to not make things worse for those that you cannot. So I think that's one way of looking at it. Another thing that
I just want to respond quickly to that. So Jim, I just want to respond to that real quickly. That's interesting about the collective consciousness thing and taking that into consideration. And at the same time, what I'm thinking is, so if everybody's doing something that we know, there's other ways to respond. By doing that, aren't we just then adding to the falseness? I mean, wouldn't a better position or but a more productive position to be, rather than fall into what everybody else is doing, and then increasing that collective consciousness that, yes, there is this thing out there that's going to kill you if you don't mask up and hide in your basement. Wouldn't it be more productive if education, where Unity started talking about the Myrtle Fillmore story and comparing, like I just did, the TB statistics compared to the COVID? And remember, Myrtle Hill herself, I mean, people gravitate to Unity because they want something different. They don't want the mainstream. So if we respond, or Unity responds doing what the mainstream is, I don't know how that's helping anybody. I mean, if people are really freaked out about it, they wouldn't come in person to church anyway, and they're just going to follow the mainstream. But, I'm thinking there needs to be a different voice, an alternative voice, so that we just don't play into the collective. A lot of it's just nonsense. So, anyway.
Well, I agree that what Unity, what ought to be taught in Unity is our Unity teachings, which are about the relationship of mind and body and the nature of truth and the nature of error and those sorts of things as they're related to healing. I agree with that. And I also recognize that not everybody's in Unity. So the ones that are going to know that and understand it, they still have to apply the principles. So in Unity, there are principles, there are teachings, and then there's also the application of it. You can know the principles without really being effective at applying them. And so that takes learning and effort and discipline. And so the people that you can reach through Unity are people that are open to it. That doesn't necessarily include everybody that you encounter, and not every encounter is an opportunity to teach. So that's why I say, don't create. That's why I say my approach anyway is don't create more anxiety by going counter to sort of what the scientists tell us. Another thing I believe is that it's related to this is that the physical, what we call the physical world. I believe that what we call the physical world, all of our perceptions, are actually perceptions of ideas. That the reality is ultimately mind. At the same time, that doesn't mean the ideas are an illusion. What it means is that what we take to be material objects are actually consist of ideas or perceptions of ideas, if we put it that way, and they have certain structures. So I don't completely reject scientific notions about what happens in the body with molecules and that sort of thing, because that's all simply the nature of the ideas, the molecular and atomic structures and that sort of thing all can be understood as ideas. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't reject the scientific sort of perspective on illness. What I do is, from my perspective, what can be added to that is an understanding of how mind can impact the body, how mind can impact the environment. And that's a challenging thing to do, and it does require, as I say, it does require learning, and it does require discipline. It's not magic, right? It all has to do with mind. Faith, even what we call faith healing, is not magic. It all has to do with the nature of mind, how our minds are connected and interact, and so we can do what we can do from within our individual perspective to respond to what we see as error. But we need to also recognize that there is this interconnection of consciousness, and that we need to, more as much as possible, act from a perspective of love and, our best judgment in the circumstances. So that's kind of how I see it.
Oh, yeah, and it's interesting, bringing up the healing comes from the mind, because I was recently teaching the fundamentals of, we had the germ theory versus terrain. We could go back to Antoine Béchamp and Louis Pasteur, and there was back in the 1900s, well, is it the germ that makes us sick, or is it the terrain, the body? And what's really interesting is that it goes along with the healing from the mind, because, we're finding more and more we're surrounded with viruses, 380 trillion viruses in and on our body. And so if the germs are killing us, we'd all be dead. We actually cooperate, and it is because of the germs and viruses that we actually thrive. And so that leads us.
That's related to what I was talking about before. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, and it leads us to then understanding the terrain, the body, which gives us so much power, because if it's the body that determines health and sickness, not the germs, then we realize, just like you saying, it's the mind that has the power. I think when we look at that terrain theory, we do have the power. And I also wanted to ask, there actually is a lot of information written about how just the wearing of masks actually creates anxiety. It doesn't lessen it. And now with kids going back to school, thinking about mandating masks, there's been a lot of psychologists saying this is going to create a high level of anxiety in children seeing people with masks. That's scary for kids. And that I've been in social situations. I recently was at a gathering, and they said, don't worry, there's no mask mandates. And everybody there was so much more relaxed. They said, oh, thank goodness we're all not in masks. And there was actually a release and less anxiety. So I think it's debatable whether wearing a mask is going to create more anxiety or lessen it, as well as the mixed science from various scientists on the benefits of mask wearing. But that's a whole other subject we don't need to get into. But I just wanted to throw that out there, because I actually become more nervous when I see people in a mask. You think of, hospitals, scary things. So in my mind, it's the opposite effect. So I don't think we can assume that for everybody it's going to relax them when they see a mask.
Right. People have individual responses to it. There are people who have anxiety when they have anxiety from having to wear a mask, or seeing masks gives them anxiety, and that's part of each individual has a sort of whole belief system, and that's what makes mind healing fascinating and challenging and very individual, because we have certain beliefs that we hold in common sort of collectively. There also is the individual factor and what their background is. So, for example, in my own case, the religion that I had exposure to in my youth was Christian Science, and Christian Science was opposed to any use of material medicine, because they believed it was counteractive to the truth that all is mind. So that was sort of my background. So I'm sure my background and my response to things is different than people who, the vast majority of society, let's face it, what their background was. Now, I've thought through some things over the years, and have seen things in new ways. So I haven't stayed still in that perspective. And so I recognize people's belief systems evolve, and that's again a sort of individual call. As a metaphysician, you want to understand who the people are you are interacting with, and what kinds of beliefs they have, and that sort of thing. And I believe in respecting people's beliefs, and I will have a conversation with them if they're really interested and want to, want to know sort of what my perspective is and what my reasons are for my perspective. So I'm always open to that. But I also recognize that a lot of people I encounter aren't really interested in that, and they're in their beliefs and they're evolving in their own way. So I believe I think in terms of mind in a way and social interactions as a process, and you can bring people, you can discover truth, you can apply it in your own life, you can help other people understand it and apply it, but you can't sort of magically change everyone's belief systems. And so, and even if you could, I don't think that would be in, as we say, in divine order. I think there's a reason we have autonomy and free will and choices. We learn from that, and from sort of my spiritual perspective, what we are learning is our true divine nature, but we're all sort of learning it at our own pace in the context in which we live and that sort of thing. So that's sort of, I think of it again as a process, respecting different people's belief systems, having conversations with them when they're open to it, sharing ideas. And, I'm not assuming, and I never assume, that I know everything and that all of my beliefs are correct. So I'm part of the process. I'm also evolving. And,
when you were talking about the mind and that everything that we're experiencing is really our perception of ideas, when you were talking about the molecular and even the atomic particles and subatomic particles, that it's all our perception, it's all ideas in the mind. It reminds me of, this discussion. There's this gentleman, Wim Hof, that a lot of people have told me about and have shared different experiences that he's done. And one of the things that he did is he actually took poison to show that he could transmute the poison in his body and that would not affect him. And so I think that's an example, though, where maybe he is at the point where he felt he was ready to do that kind of a demonstration. And I'm sure he didn't just start out that way, too. He probably did a lot of training leading up to that. But, when we're talking about some of these things, it's like I think a lot of people would have the belief, and a very strong belief, that if they took poison, that they would die. So, they would take the poison and they would die just like they believe they do. So I do agree that we need to look at each individual's belief system and where they are in their path, take those things into consideration. So it's really interesting, though, because there's this, it seems to be this unification or a drawing together, at least, of science and spirituality, or the way I think of it sometimes as physics and metaphysics. And so I'm wondering if, since we talk a lot about that reality is just in mind, our perception of the truth. And you were talking about with Christian Science, they would not even use medication because they felt like it interfered with the concept that, we can heal everything with the mind. And yet I realized along the way, just observing some different things, like I remember watching a shaman work one time, and, he was taking something and kind of going around this person with smoke and had a feather and just different things like that. And I realized that there's a lot of traditions like shamanism and even different forms of witchcraft and Wiccan and different things like that, where people use these things almost like symbols to kind of reinforce this idea that something is actually happening. So it's not the smoke or the feather that's actually healing the person, but shaman says you're getting better and you're healing, and then they go around the person with a feather and smoke and stuff like that, kind of reinforce that idea. And you talked a little bit earlier about the placebo effect, and it reminded me of this story about this doctor in the Second World War who ran out of medication, and so he actually started writing the medication he would have given the person on these little slips of paper and giving it to them, so they would swallow this piece of paper with the medication written on it. And a lot of his patients were actually showing signs of improvement doing that. So, the pharmaceutical company sees the placebo effect as something to overcome, to show that their medication is actually working. But I really feel like that's a real clue that we're missing. It's showing the power of the mind to make a difference in the body. And so could you kind of talk about like the some of the connections you see between science and spirituality, and how that may relate to the placebo effect and the mind's ability to heal?
That what you're saying was really interesting, and I actually think that's not only something that I agree with, but I've recently discovered some of the research that supports the idea that the placebo effect isn't just a matter of individual beliefs, but it's also partly a matter of what we might call acculturation. So here's what I mean by that. When you walk into a doctor's office or a hospital, there's certain things that are part of that experience, right? You're greeted by someone, they take information, you go in and you talk to the doctor, one-on-one in a confidential situation. And think about how that is not unlike some of the rituals that are part of, going to church, right? When you go to church, there are greeters, right? They'll hand you a program very often, right? And if you're Catholic, then you might go in and or if you're Catholic, you might go into the confessional where you sit only with that priest, who's the sort of the authority in the situation and is wearing robes like the doctor wears a white jacket. So you see what I'm saying? There's different kinds of social clues that strengthen the placebo effect. This is one of the things that they've discovered recently, because there are people, I should say, who are doing research just on what the placebo effect is, how it works, when it works better, that sort of thing. So there's actually things that are already known about how to more effectively use whatever that mechanism is in the mind to help people heal. And so in the case of shaman, if they're using feathers and that sort of thing, that's part of their culture and what people sort of expect as or feel comfortable with entering into a situation in which they have an expectation that a healing is going to occur. So people, when they walk into a doctor's office, have certain ideas about what's going to happen there. People who walk into the priest's confessional have certain ideas about what's going to happen there, and so on. And they aren't just like individual beliefs, but they're actually things that we've been socialized to. In our put it in terms of brain. Our brain has been sort of conditioned to respond to these clues. So it's really interesting that the placebo effect. This is specifically a question of neuroscience and I guess to some degree sociology. But so the way the mind works is being explored. It's getting better. It's getting understood better and better. Because people are looking, there are serious researchers looking at, okay, what is the placebo effect? How does it work? As you pointed out, when they're doing studies of medications and even other kinds of treatments, they want to compare what they're experimenting with a group that's getting a placebo that just simply believe that they're getting it, and if the placebo effect is say, 20, say. Typically it'd be like 20% effective. And so often it's more than that, but let's say it's 20% effective and the medication is like 50% effective, then they'll say, okay, this is a real medication that really works, right? So what they've learned from that is that, okay, there's probably something happening with I guess a simple way of putting it is something happening with the interaction of the molecules in this medication with the molecules in your body and your organs and that sort of thing that's going to produce some kind of positive effect, along with the side effects, which aren't always so positive. But anyway, that's another story. So anyway, the point, I guess the point is that there's a lot of evidence that the mind affects the body and the health, and there's a lot of things that we know about what kinds of things have beneficial effects. I think one of the best known experiments, I want to tie back into, I tell about this in my book, The Hidden Realm of God, but a lot of people, at least certain circles, have heard about this research where it was done at Harvard, and what they did was they tested chemicals that are part of the immune system in the human body. They tested them in this group that they're studying, and they had the group watch a film about Mother Teresa tending to the poorest of the poor in Calcutta, and then after they watched the film, they tested the chemical again and found that there had been an increase in this important chemical that's part of the immune system that fights off infection and that sort of thing. So then that's called the Mother Teresa effect or whatever. And but then later studies were done in which people were taught to meditate on love and compassion. There's taught meditation method for that, but they basically did the same thing. They took their sample of the chemical, the immune chemical, before the persons did the meditation, and then they did it afterwards, and they found again there was this increase in the chemical from contemplating love, from focusing on compassion, and it actually was a greater increase in those who learned to meditate on love than there was in those who were watching the movie. But the point is, in both cases, there's something about entering into a consciousness of love that apparently strengthens the immune system. So there's a really sort of interesting connection between spirituality and physiology, and of course that again can be understood in terms of a reality that's ultimately mind. We could get into that and physics, how that's related to modern physics, but you probably don't have enough time left in this program to do that.
No, it seems like we're just barely scratching the surface because we do have a couple of minutes here, and I just wanted to kind of put a dot on that point you were making there, because it makes a lot of sense then why Jesus was focusing on teaching love constantly. And actually forgiveness is really a way to get us back into love, get us out of our grudges and back into a state of love, because like you were saying, focusing on love in our meditation boosts our immune system, which keeps us healthier. And so, yeah, that's a really interesting connection. Kind of brings us full circle here, because we only have about a minute or so left here before the end, but I did want to give you just a moment, Jim, if you can just share how people can get a hold of your books and get a hold of you if they'd like to.
Oh, okay. So my book, The Hidden Realm of God, Historical Jesus and His Healing Philosophy, the whole thing is available on Amazon. So you just plug in the Hidden Realm of God or into the search on the Amazon website, and you can order it either in ebook form, or Kindle form, I should say, or the paperback. And the book that you also mentioned, The Essential Charles Fillmore, that's going to be there are some copies of it that's still available in some local bookstores and through Amazon, but there's a revised version that's going to be coming out, I think, in either November or December. So a revised version is coming out, and that would be available. I think it's probably also available through Amazon.com, but that would actually be available through Unity House or Unity Books.
All right. Well, thanks, Jim. That's all the time we're going to have for today. But thank you so much for being part of our program today, and look forward to getting into some of these things more deeply with you later on. So we love having all of you with us.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. We love having you all with us, so please connect with us on Facebook at Spirit's Journey Radio. Be sure to like our page. And you've been listening to Spirit's Journey Live on Truth Frequency Radio, simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio. I'm Patrick.
I'm Catherine. Thanks